The first inhabitants in Australia were the ancestors of the present indigenous people. Whether these first migrations involved one or several successive waves and distinct peoples is still subject to academic debate, as is its timing. The minimum widely accepted time frame places presence of humans in Australia at 40,000 to 43,000 years before present, while the upper range supported by others is 60,000 to 70,000 years BP. In any event, this migration was achieved during the closing stages of the Pleistocene epoch, when sea levels were typically much lower than they are today. Repeated episodes of extended glaciation resulted in decreases of sea levels by some 100 to 150 meters. The continental coastline therefore extended much further out into the Timor Sea than it does today, and Australia and New Guinea formed a single landmass, known as Sahuli, connected by an extensive land bridge across the Arafura Sea, Gulf of Carpentaria and Torres Strait. The ancestral Australian Aboriginal peoples were thus long established and continued to develop, diversify and settle through much of the continent. As the sea levels again rose at the terminus of the most recent glacial period some 10,000 years ago, the Australian continent once more became a separated landmass. However, the newly formed 150 km wide Torres Strait with its chain of islands still provided the means for cultural contact and trade between New Guinea and the northern Cape York Peninsula. During the 1970s and 1980s, around 120,000 Southern Asian refugees migrated to Australia. During that 20 years, Australia first began to adopt a policy of what Minister of Immigration Al Grasby termed multiculturalism. In 2004 to 2005, Australia accepted 123,000 new settlers, a 40% increase over the past 10 years. The largest number of immigrants, 40,000 in 2004 to 2005, moved to Sydney. The majority of immigrants came from Asia, led by China and India.
Commission-only sales compensation plans are exactly what they sound like. You pay your salespeople for the sales they bring in and nothing else. There is no guarantee of income. These types of plans are easier to administer than salary plus commission and provide better value for your money paid, as they are based solely on sales achieved. They also tend to attract fewer candidates, but do attract the most top-performing and hardest-working sales professionals who know they can make a good income because they know how to sell. On the other hand, though, they can create aggression within your sales team and low income security, which can lead to a high turnover rate and sales rep burnout from stress. So what do we mean by well-being? Health, happiness, a sense of achievement and contentment, a state of mind and body where people can thrive. Well-being is not something that is purely limited to people who are facing extraordinary challenges in their lifestyle, health or personal circumstances. Everybody here has a level of well-being. Music so often forms an intuitive part of our well-being management, music to pick us up, music to calm us down, music to heal our sorrows. Our aim through research is to move from this level of intuitive application of music through to informed use in our communities to take the next step in the understanding of the power of music in human life. Music already works for us on so many levels, whether it's soothing and teaching our infants, bringing people and communities together, adding spirit to our work and personal endeavors, but there is no reason to stop here.
Frogs are a diverse and largely carnivorous group of short-bodied, tailless amphibians composing the order Anura. The oldest fossil proto-frog appeared in the early Triassic of Madagascar, but molecular clock dating suggests their origins may extend further back to the Permian, 265 million years ago. Frogs are widely distributed, ranging from the tropics to subarctic regions, but the greatest concentration of species diversity is found in tropical rainforests. There are approximately 4,800 recorded species, accounting for over 85% of extant amphibian species. They are also one of the 5 most diverse vertebrate orders. Besides living in fresh water and on dry land, the adults of some species are adapted for living underground or in trees. Adult frogs generally have a carnivorous diet consisting of small invertebrates, but omnivorous species exist and a few feed on fruit. Frogs are extremely efficient at converting what they eat into body mass. They are an important food source for predators and part of the food web dynamics of many of the world's ecosystems. The skin is semi-permeable, making them susceptible to dehydration, so they either live in moist places or have special adaptations to deal with dry habitats.
Welcome to your very first tutorial in biology. Now, in this video series what I want to do is I want to talk to you guys about many different topics concerning biology. For example, I want to talk to you guys about DNA and genetics in cells, in bacteria, in life and a whole bunch of interesting stuff. But since this is the very first video, I think what we should do in this video is just stick with the very basics. And the first thing I want to do is talk to you guys about what is biology. So, let's go ahead and answer that question. And the definition of biology is this: the study of life in living organisms. Alright, that makes sense up to a certain point up until organisms, because you may have heard of organisms before. And you may have your own definition, but the scientific definition of an organism is a living thing. Well, that's easy. We know what living things are. I'm a living thing, plants, grass is a living thing. My puppy named Old Dan, cutest puppy ever, by the way, is a living thing. But whenever we talk about living things, believe it or not, things get rid of complicated, because then you have to ask yourself, what is life? Well, of course, if you ask your grandma or your best friend, or even if you ask a philosopher what is life, everyone is going to give you kind of a different definition of their outlook on life. However, whenever scientists and biologists were first deciding, you know what is life? That's the problem, that everyone had their own separate definition of life itself. So, what they need to do before biology was even invented, which is, of course, the study of life, is scientists needed to agree on the definition of life.
The sound of a cracking knee isn't particularly pleasant. But it gets worse when you listen up close. Knee cracking, recording it is for most people. But for me, it actually just makes me excited. Omer Iran, an electrical engineer at Georgia Tech. I actually feel like there's some real information in them that can be exploited for the purposes of helping people with rehab. Iran's experience with cracking knees goes back to his days as an undergrad at Stanford, where he threw discus. If I had a really hard workout, then the next day, of course, I'd be sore, but I'd also sometimes feel this catching or popping or creaking every now and then in my knee. A few years later, he found himself building tiny microphones at a high-end audio company. So when he got to Georgia Tech and heard the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, wanted better tech for knee injuries, he thought, knee cracking recording, why not strap tiny microphones to people's knees, to eavesdrop as their legs bend? What we think it is the cartilage and bone rubbing against each other, the surfaces inside the knee rubbing against each other, during those movements. He and a team of physiologists and engineers built a prototype with stretchy athletic tape and a few tiny mics and skin sensors. And preliminary tests on athletes suggest the squishy sounds the device picks up are more erratic, and more irregular, in an injured knee than in a healthy one. Which Ivan says might allow patients and doctors to track healing after surgery. Details appear in the IEEE Transactions on Biomedical Engineering.
Haussmann's renovation of Paris was a vast public works program commissioned by Emperor Napoleon III and directed by his prefect of the Seine, Georges Eugène Haussmann, between 1853 and 1870. It included the demolition of crowded and unhealthy medieval neighborhoods, the building of wide avenues, parks and squares, the annexation of the suburbs surrounding Paris, and the construction of new sewers, fountains and aqueducts. Haussmann's work met with fierce opposition, and he was finally dismissed by Napoleon III in 1870. But work on his projects continued until 1927. The street plan and distinctive appearance of the center of Paris today is largely the result of Haussmann's renovation. In the middle of the 19th century, the center of Paris was overcrowded, dark, dangerous, and unhealthy. In 1845 the French social reformer Victor Considerate wrote, "Paris is an immense workshop of putrefaction, where misery, pestilence and sickness work in concert, where sunlight and air rarely penetrate. Paris is a terrible place where plants shrivel and perish, and where, of 7 small infants, 4 die during the course of the year." The street plan on the Taille de la site and in the neighborhood called the Quartier des Arcs, between the Louvre and the Hôtel de Ville, had changed little since the Middle Ages. The population density in these neighborhoods was extremely high, compared with the rest of Paris.
The arising concern that a lot of people have about raising children bilingually, especially the preschool year, is based on the conceptualization that the human brain at birth is essentially monolingual. And the reason why I come to this occasion. Because often the parents will ask me if they use 2 languages at home, will their child be confused, because they're hearing 2 languages? And parents are often asked my advice about whether they should use 1 language on parent role, which is widely known that parents who are raising children bilingually. And the reason why most people think this is a good idea is that it will help to reduce the risks of the children being confused. Because they were able to associate each language with the separate speaker. The fear is that both parents use both languages, especially they use both languages interchangeable within the same conversation, within the same sentences. The child will not be able to separate the languages.
I have said before that you can't have a civilization that doesn't have art. When we think about the great civilizations historically, all of them had a great production of culture and art because a society did not fail to observe itself. The sophistication of the great civilizations were their ability to look at themselves. What exactly allows a society to do to be the producers of art and culture and to mirror back to the core of the society? What is being produced at that moment? How do people think of themselves, and how are the individuals relating to the social structure at that time? Art is the vehicle in which guides us towards understanding what we were to take away from art. What would be that mirror? How do we see what we are about? How would we understand what was going on in Paris at the time of the Impressionists when people were learning to see in a completely different way? Before cinematography and similar link that were invented, people looked at the world in a very different way, which was considered very radical at that time.
But in the face of this sense of disempowerment, there is surprisingly a decline in involvement in organizations which seek to share wealth and opportunities, protect one another's rights and work towards the common good. According to the United Nations, civil society groups have grown 40-fold since the turn of last century. Internationally, the non-profit sector is worth $1 trillion, and there are 700,000 such organizations in Australia alone. The UN recognizes 37,000 specifically civil society organizations across the globe, and gave 3,500 accreditation to the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development. This profound movement towards harnessing voices and resources from outside the realm of governments and officialdom reflects a profound growth in NGOs' third sector, as some call it. As Robert Putnam discovered in the field of local government in Italy, the best predictor of governmental success was the strength and density of a region's civic associations.
The Western countries' women are becoming more and more reluctant to give birth to babies. However, the male status in society remains as strong as it ever has in recent years. The birth rates increased during the 20th century, but it started to decrease over these last 2 decades. In the year 2000, as an example, the birth rate remained around 1%. There are even some negative birth rates in other countries. Birth rates dropped to its lowest point that has never been seen in the society. It also has an impact on male in the society, particularly young men, and it might have some connection with unemployment rates as well.
Wilson came from a different world. He became the focal point of a mainstream American culture that only thought of modern literature and wanted it to be read and appreciated by ordinary people. They were not modernists in an abstract sense. Certainly some of writers like T.S. Eliot and Faulkner were too difficult for some of their writings to be read by ordinary people. But this was a world long ago, before the division between our brows or whatever had established itself as a part of our consciousness. Wilson was a major player in the successful effort of his generation to establish at the heart of American life and innovative literature that would equal the great cultures of Europe. He was not a product of a narrow-minded American studies training at all. He joined a high artistic standard with an openness to all experience and a belief that literature was as much of a part of life for everyone as much as it is for daily conversation. He thought that Proust, Joyce, Yeats and Eliot could and should be read by ordinary Americans, and he helped to make that to happen.
Determinant: human behavior is affected by internal and external factors. At the end of lecture, the speaker mentioned that psychologists are interested in explaining human behavior. Determinant is influenced by 2 factors, the personal factors which are internal and the environmental factors which are external. The personal factors include people's belief on certain things and their individual thinking about it, while the environmental factors include temperature, air pressure and the others thinking about them. In conclusion, one's determinant are affected by both himself and the environment.
So that creates tensions, and that's what I want to talk about. Because I think it's important that we are, as a society, able to have an informed debate about how much privacy is enough but not too much, how much security is enough but not too much. Privacy, as a human right, that's simply quoting the Universal Declaration. In the physical world, we've got all kinds of protections. There is evidence that we care about our privacy. We've got locks, we've got obscured glass, we've got lots, we wear clothes, we put up shutters. And technology continues to erode the privacy that exists in the real world, in the three spatial dimensions. Security cameras, automatic number plate recognition take away anonymity. Long lenses, paparazzi, take away distance and the privacy that used to create. And body scanners are increasingly being used to see through, for example. This process isn't going to slow down, and the new quantum technologies are actually being able to do gravitational sensing. And that's advancing at a remarkable rate. And you can't shield gravity. So some of the new quantum technologies are able already to see through walls. And there are technologies also for seeing round corners now using scattered light from lasers. Technology continues to erode privacy.
Brain development during childhood. There are 3 stages, starting from the primitive brain, limbic brain, and finally to the neocortex. Although interrelated, the 3 had its own function. Primitive brain functions to manage the physical to survive, manage reflex, motor motion control, monitoring body functions, and process information coming from sensing. Limbic brain functioning as a liaison to process emotions, and the brain thinks, and the primitive brain. While the thinking brain, which is the most objective part of the brain, receiving input from the primitive brain and the limbic brain. However, he needed more time to process information from the primitive brain and the limbic brain. The brain thinks the merger is also a place of experience, memory, feeling, and thinking ability to give birth to ideas and actions. Nerve myelination of the brain takes place in sequence, starting from the primitive brain, the limbic brains, and brain thought. Neural pathways are more frequently used to make more myelin thicken. Increasingly thicker myelin, the faster the nerve impulses or signals travel along nerves. Therefore, a growing child is encouraged to receive input from the environment in accordance with its development.
The powerful influence of Stevenson's text on the discourse of dissociation is strikingly apparent in the work of American physician and psychologist Morton Prince. Reber credits Prince with pioneering the phenomenon of popularizing MPD as embodied in a spectacular case. Prince's Dissociation of a Personality, 1905, tells the story of Miss Christine Beecham, a pseudonym for Clara Norton Fowler, who, according to Prince, is a person in whom several personalities have become developed.